أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers, respected elders and these sisters if they are present. I want to begin by thanking Sheikh Sulaiman Ghani and the Mosque Committee of Purley Mosque for inviting me today to deliver a lecture on the Uyghur Muslims of East Turkestan. Now before I proceed, I want to ask everyone here a basic question. Have you heard of the situation of what's happening in Syria? Yeah? Palestine? Kashmir? What happened in Gujarat many years ago under the leadership of the BJP? We heard of what's happening in the Rohingya. We heard of what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. But honestly, have you ever heard of the situation of our Uyghur brothers and sisters in East Turkestan? In fact, did you even know that there was 20 million Muslims in this part of China and they've been there for the best part of 2,000-3,000 years? You knew. But you don't hear about it much, do you? And this is why I personally believe that the Uyghur Muslims of East Turkestan are one of the most oppressed group of Muslims in the world. And they're the most neglected because they're not spoken about much. And not many people know much about them, who they are, culturally, ethnically, theologically. Who are these people? Who is the Uyghur? Some people can't even pronounce the word. I couldn't pronounce the word many years ago. So that's why it is very important that we don't differentiate between the blood and the honor of Muslims, irrelevant of where they are. Because we know of the hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that a single drop of blood of the believer is more than the Kaaba and everything in it. So we do not differentiate between the blood of an Arab and a Turk, or the blood of an Asian or a white person. The blood of a believer, and generally speaking, the blood of humanity in general, is something which is sacred in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Before I proceed with today's lecture, I believe it's important to clarify a few things. So the word Uyghur is the way it's actually pronounced, but in English they call it Uyghur, and they are ethnically Turks, the original Turkish people that came from Central Asia. We have some brothers from Uzbekistan. Wallahi, feel free to correct me if there's any historical inaccuracies in anything that I say. So our brothers in East Turkestan, they are ethnic Turks. And this land called East Turkestan is actually known as Xinjiang. And that's the Chinese word for it. But I'm not going to use the word Xinjiang, because the word Xinjiang is the occupied word used by the Chinese. In the same way, we do not refer to some parts of Kashmir as India. We refer to all of it as Kashmir. And nor do we refer to all of Israel as Palestine. All of it is Palestine. So by using certain language, you give certain legitimacy to the occupation and the oppression of our brothers and sisters. So in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, I will refer to this area as East Turkestan. And Turkestan in Persian means the land of the Turks. And it covers the land which today covers Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, some parts of Afghanistan, some parts of China, and East Turkestan falls in its western flank. So that's just some clarification so you know what I'm talking about through the entirety of this lecture. When I say East Turkestan, it's the region of Xinjiang in China. And when I say Uyghur, I'm talking about the ethnic Muslims that have been there for over 1,000 years. I have a special message for everyone here today. From a dear brother of mine, his name is Abdul Ghani Thabit. He is an Uyghur Muslim activist who is currently living in Holland, but he's originally from East Turkestan. Sadly, he's had family and friends who have been kidnapped by the Chinese government. I'll explain to you what this situation is later on, but he has a special message for our brothers and sisters today.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. Jazakallah khairan, Sheikh Sulaiman Abdul Ghani at Purley Mosque, south of London. and brother Dilly Hussain for hosting this event on Uyghur Muslim situation in East Turkestan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As you know, the Chinese occupation of East Turkestan, they are extrajudicial arresting, disappearance, and killing the Uyghur Muslims still going on. Last year, the Chinese government collecting DNA samples and also voice patterns the Uyghur Muslims. And also the Chinese government forced the Muslims to install GPS system on their cars because the government want to monitor their activities and conversations. As you know, the Chinese government detained millions of Uyghur people in the concentration camp to sing a Chinese red song and also force them to dance. For example, last year, end of 2017 and beginning of 2018, the Chinese government arranged more than 1 million Chinese cadres to Uyghur people's house to monitor their daily activities and sleep, eat together. This so-called disgraceful policy towards the Uyghurs, the Chinese government called enhanced ethnic united. As you know, the Chinese New Year, the Chinese government forced Uyghur people to eat the Chinese jiaozi. We don't know that's halal or haram. And also, the Chinese government forced Uyghur people to decorate their house as like a Chinese traditional house. Actually, I would like to say more, and I would like to stay with you at the mosque, but with a limit of time, I will finish my words. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Jazakallah khairan to my dear brother Abdul Ghani Thabit for giving us that brief insight into the unfortunate and dire situation of our Uyghur brothers and sisters in East Turkestan, and I'll expand on some of the things which he said if you couldn't understand him clearly because of the quality of the video. So today's lecture is going to be a bit of a history lecture, and I don't want to bore everyone with too much history. I also want to make today's lecture a bit different in that usually people ask questions right at the end. If anyone wants to ask any questions or even to correct me on anything, feel free to put your hand up during any time of this talk, inshallah, and we will proceed like this. So you don't need to hold your questions back right till the end. If you have something urgent you want to clarify there and then, just ask me, inshallah. So to give a bit of background as to who the Uyghur Muslims are, as I mentioned in the introduction, they are ethnic Turks. Now when you think of Turks, the first thing you think of is Turkey. But the Turks, predominantly speaking in Turkey today, they are a mix of Caucasians, Armenians, Greeks. That's why their features are very different and a bit similar to Europeans, because for centuries they mixed with Europeans during the Uthmani Khilafah or during the Ottoman Empire. Whereas the original Turks, who they are descendants of, they come from Central Asia and they look like our beautiful brothers here. And the background of the Uyghurs was that they were one branch, one tribe of the branch of Oghuz. Oghuz Khan is considered the founding father of the Turkish people. He wasn't a Muslim, but he was considered the founding father of the Turkish people. And from the Oghuz lineage came many, many tribes, including the Seljuks, the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and many, many other groups came out of the lineage of Oghuz Khan. And generally speaking, to begin with, they were part of a wider Turkish confederation, which meaning they made up a group of different tribes who were part of what you would regard as a jama'ah, a big group of different tribes who shared the same lineage. And they originated in Central Asia. And the reason why some of these tribes, not the Uyghurs, but some of the Turkish tribes moved westward was because of the Mongols. When the Mongols came out of Mongolia under the savage leadership of Genghis Khan, some of the Turkish tribes had to move westward because of their savagery. But later on, the Uyghur Turks were significantly influenced by Persians and Mongol culture later on, and we'll get to that later on in the talk. But with regards to before they accepted Islam, the religion of the Uyghurs was shamanism, or known as Tengism. Just like the Muslims of India, before we became Muslim, we were Hindus, or our ancestors most likely than not were the Hindus. So similarly, the Turkish people, they followed a religion called Tengism. And that was basically revering your ancestors, worshipping nature, and so forth. Some accepted Buddhism later on, but it was only during the late 10th century that we started seeing the Uyghur Muslims accepting Islam. When they did accept Islam, the vast majority were Hanafi in madhab, they were Sufi inclined, and they were either Maturidi or Ash'ari with regards to their theological affiliation. And it predominantly still is up until today. And there's three periods of history which is important for us to understand to kind of get a picture of why the situation is the way it is today in East Turkestan. When you speak from it from an academic perspective, or you speak to a Western historian, they talk about Uyghur history in 7 parts. I'm not going to speak about the first 4 parts because the first 4 parts of their history, they were not Muslim. So I think it's relevant for us to understand that the situation that the Uyghur Muslims find themselves today is specifically and exclusively and solely because they are Muslim. So I am not going to cover the initial 4 aspects of their history. I'm going to cover 3 periods of history, and that is the Mongol expansion between 1200 to 1760. I will touch briefly upon that because it is kind of relevant. But mainly the occupation by the Manchu Empire or the King dynasty of East Turkestan, the Republican era between 1910 to 1949, and the period of communist China from 1949 to the present day. So just to touch upon a bit of the Islamic background, the Uyghur Muslims accepted Islam around the middle of the 10th century under the Kharakhanid Khanate. The Kharakhanid Khanate were a Mongol offshoot, and it was in 934 when Sultan Boghrul Khan accepted Islam that we started seeing Uyghur Muslims accept Islam in their droves. Prior to this, there weren't many Muslim Uyghurs. And the Mongol Empire accepted Islam between 100 to 150 years after the life of Genghis Khan. Some of the Sunni scholars at the time said that initially they didn't necessarily accept Islam wholeheartedly. It was more for political reasons, and there were questions with regards to their commitment to actual Islam. However, from the different offshoot empires, because remember the Mongol Empire was a vast empire, it stretched from China all the way up to the gates of Europe. But it was the one empire which became very fragmented in a short space of time. And when it became fragmented, it became different empires. So you got the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanates, the Chagatai Khanate, the Great Khanate. From these 4, 3 were regarded as Muslim, but realistically from these 3, only one of the Mongol offshoot empire was actually regarded as Orthodox Islam, and that was the Chagatai Khanate. So for those of us who are from the Indian subcontinent, we know of the Mughals. The Mughals claimed their descendancy from the Chagatai Khanate, and you even see Muslims from India with the second name Chagatai. And the East Chagatai Khanate became known as Moghulistan, and they lasted and they controlled East Turkestan between 1200 to 1760. And it is in this period that we started seeing the Uyghur Muslims flourish, their culture flourish, many of their leaders attaining positions of authority and power within the Eastern Chagatai Khanate. We also saw that many ulama and many madrasas were built in this period within Moghulistan, and they were spearheaded by Uyghur ulama and movements. However, in 1760, Moghulistan went to war with the King dynasty The Qing dynasty was the last imperial empire of China. The English call them Manchu, so I will refer to them as the Manchu Empire. So the Manchu Empire was at war with Mongolistan between 1760 to 1910. Actually, no, 1760, not to 19, 1760. And eventually, by 1884, they had conquered East Turkestan, and they named it Xinjiang, which in Chinese means new frontier. So it is from this period onward that we then started to see the systematic and the structural oppression of Uyghur Muslims for no other reason except that they believed in La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. There was no other reason. There was no other reason except that they were Muslim, they were ethnically different, they looked different, their culture was different, their women dressed different, they killed their animals differently, they celebrate different festivals, etc., etc. So from 1884 onwards, this was the beginning or the continuation of what we see today. So the Manchu Empire in 1884 began its systematic oppression of the Uyghur Muslims of East Turkestan, which they had named Xinjiang. However, the Manchu Empire was overthrown by Chinese nationalists in 1910. So East Turkestan then came under the control of Chinese warlords. The oppression continued, the same policies continued. Then in 1920, we then saw the birth of Uyghur nationalism. And this was ultimately supported and backed by Soviet Russia. In 1921, communist leaders from the Soviet Union met with many Turkish leaders in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. They met with Uzbek leaders, Tajik leaders, Turkmen leaders, Uyghur leaders. And essentially the meeting was about establishing an independent communist state. In reality, all Russia wanted was an extension to their empire. They just wanted proxy states to fulfill their geopolitical interests. But out of difficulty, out of hardship, out of desperation, many of these countries subscribed to communist ideals, some more than others. We know that the history of Central Asia and communism was a dark period in history. It was a dark period in history where Quran classes had to be done underground, where you could not be overtly visually Muslim, and ultimately communism is an ideology which is essentially godless. It does not believe in God, it does not believe in spirit, it just believes in matter. So any such ideology like this would never allow the flourishing of any deen, any religion, to flourish in its country. But that said, many Turkish leaders met with the Soviet Union in Tashkent in 1921, and they nominally subscribed to the communist ideals. And then in 1933, we saw the birth of the first East Turkestan Republic, which is called the East Turkestan Islamic Republic, and it was personally supported by Stalin. This state, this republic, didn't even last 1 year. China had defeated the Uyghurs in the Battle of Kashgar, and this republic was finished within a year. Then in 1944, we saw the birth of the second East Turkestan Republic. This lasted for 5 years. But again, the Russian support was not enough. What actually ended up happening was that Russia ended up siding with the Chinese communists, because they're fellow communists, right? So this second republic lasted for 5 years. And communist China defeated the Uyghur independence movement, and they renamed East Turkestan as Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, when it was far from anything but autonomous. And so this brings us to the situation from 1949 to the current day now. As I mentioned, that the continuation of oppression of our brothers and sisters in East Turkestan had begun in 1884, and it has just been getting worse and worse up until today. So what is the actual situation of our brothers and sisters there? So since 1949, we've seen endless number of peaceful protests, peaceful political movements. They've never resorted to violence. always demanded equal rights, always demanded the right to practice their religion freely without having to impose it on anyone else. And they have been brutally shut down. Ulama, activists, women, our sisters, been kidnapped, been killed, died in prison. Hundreds and hundreds of them, if not thousands, in this period. And the situation got worse during the dawn of the War on Terror. Because when the War on Terror happened, this gave the Chinese government further legitimacy to carry on its campaign against the Uyghur Muslims. Because now it wasn't a case about dealing with separatists or nationalists. It was now dealing with Islamist terrorists. We've heard this. We've heard this utterance before in many parts of the Muslim world, when Muslims merely demand equal rights to practice their deen freely, when they want to defend the honor of their family and their women and their property, immediately they are labeled terrorists, or they're labeled as some kind of threat to the state. And so what we started seeing in the last 50 to 60 years, I'll get back to the War on Terror, but we started seeing in the last 50 to 60 years is the mass migration of Han Chinese to East Turkestan. Now there's nothing wrong with migration. Many of our elders are here, maybe yourselves or your fathers, just like my dada, my grandfather came here as economic migrants. So there's nothing wrong with migration. There's a problem with systemic migration. Migration based on race. And we saw what happened in Palestine when the Jews of Europe came in their millions to Palestine, and what that meant for the Muslims of Palestine. No jobs, no economic prosperity, being forced to live like refugees in their own countries. And this is similar to what happened in East Turkestan from the period of 1949 onward. Millions upon millions upon millions of Han Chinese were moved from the urban areas of China to East Turkestan, and they were given the best jobs. They were made to pay the least taxes. They were given, their farmers were requested to give less taxes and less food towards the economy. And it was outright socio-economic subjugation and oppression of the Uyghur Muslims. And this is what happens. This is what happens when migration is done for political causes. Not out of genuine need of humanitarian needs, or not because someone's genuinely escaping a war or an area of famine. This wasn't the situation here. The situation here was that the Chinese government was taking millions of who it regarded as its own people, putting them to East Turkestan, forcing the youth of East Turkestan to come south towards China to do all the very hard labor factory work, and the best jobs and the best development projects were given to the Han Chinese. But the War on Terror really cemented this oppression. And it was no longer about the Uyghurs looking different or dressing different or being ethnically different. It became abundantly clear that this was solely and exclusively to do with the fact that they followed Islam. And what do I mean by this? Just to give you some examples of the situation right now. In terms of laws, we're not talking about certain Chinese gangs implementing these things. This is law, as the brother mentioned in his video. So, you cannot possess the Quran in public. If you are caught with the Quran, with the Mus'haf in public, you will get fined. If you repeat the offense, you will go to prison. Our brothers and sisters cannot pay the fine because it's so high, number one, and two, because they don't have the jobs to afford these fines. So you cannot possess the Quran in public. They have banned fasting during Ramadan if you are working in public offices. Doesn't matter how old you are or how healthy and fit you are, you cannot fast during Ramadan if you are working in the public sector. Private sector is up to the boss, but most likely it's probably the same there as well. Men cannot have trousers above their ankles. Men between 18 to 40 cannot have beards. Our sisters who have genuine health problems, when they go to the doctors, they are given sterilization pills. The sister might go there for a headache, or might go there for some stomachache or some genuine illness. The doctors then give them pills which sterilize them, so they're trying to do birth control. The Chinese government regularly tests nuclear weapons in East Turkestan. I remember East Turkestan is a very big land, but it just happens to test nuclear weapons in the land, in the areas which is heavily populated by Muslims. And then there's the re-education camps. Now, what I'm about to tell you, you're going to think, no way does this exist. It exists. There's this thing called re-education camps. They have now set up in the last couple of years. Re-education camps is where the Chinese government, by law, has said that a certain number of Uyghur Muslims have to go to these camps. Why? It's so they can adopt Chinese values. Whilst they say that Uyghur Muslims have to voluntarily go there, when they realize that Uyghur Muslims are not voluntarily coming forward, they'll start kidnapping the youth. So what's happened now? Uyghur elders, uncles, grandfathers have said, you know what? We will go. Because we've lived through this period of tens of years and we believe our deen is strong. So let us send, and plus we're coming towards the end of our time anyway. We're 60, 70, 80. We don't want our youth going to these re-education. So what you now find is many elderly people coming forward to go to these re-education camps just so the youth are not kidnapped. So brothers and sisters are not kidnapped and forced to go to these re-education camps. What happens in these re-education camps? They are forced to sing communist anthems. If anyone here understands the communist ideology, they do not believe in a God. They do not believe in a hereafter. They do not even believe in the concept of spirit. Men are forced to dance with other wives. Other wives are forced to dance with other husbands. What the English call it, a swingers party. They are forced to dance with each other's women. They are forced to drink wine. A lot of this stuff is happening whilst there's armed guards at every exit point. So you can kind of understand what happens if you fail to comply. You are forced to sing the national anthem every day. You are forced to praise the Maoist ideology every day. And this is some of the stuff that takes place in these re-education camps. They believe that by doing these things, the Uyghur Muslims will become Chinese in the way they understand it, or that they will renounce their faith. This is some of the stuff that's happening in the re-education camps, and this is by law, my dear brothers and respected elders. This is by law. This is stuff which reminds me of Nazi Germany. But that was back in 1939 to 1945. We're in 2018 now. To think that such a situation, such a reality exists in a country which claims to be one of the superpowers of the world is worrying. I have never heard of re-education camps in Kashmir. I've never heard of re-education camps in Syria. I've never heard of re-education camps in any of these major places where we know Muslims are being oppressed and attacked. But in China, people are being kidnapped and forced to go to these camps. And because the youth are not coming forward because they're passionate and they have zeal and they want to resist, their elders are coming forward. I've given you all this reality, this situation, and it's an unfortunate one, it's a sad one. But I don't want to end on a negative note, because this is not from the sunnah of our beloved Prophet ﷺ. He said it is from the believers to be optimistic, to always think the best of Allah, to always think the best of our brothers and sisters, to always think the best result will happen, if not in this life, then the next. So, what kind of lessons can we take from the experience of our Uyghur brothers and sisters? Number one, these are lessons I have identified from my reading, from my assessment. The failure of nationalism. The failure of nationalism. Our Uyghur brothers, they had two republics. One lasted barely a year, the other one barely lasted 5 years. And this was the case with not just the Uyghurs or East Turkestan, but post-colonial world, many countries, whether it's the Arab world or the Indian subcontinent or Africa, many countries had tried and tested nationalism based on the nation state, and we've seen the horrors, the economic and the political horrors that many of these economically developing countries who have adopted this beautiful model of statehood, what they are suffering. So that's the first lesson, the failure of postmodern nationalism. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ was very, very harsh and strong in his condemnation towards the concept of asabiyya. Very harsh. There are two specific hadith that come to mind. One of them I cannot even utter it because that's how bad and sickening he compared asabiyya to. And that's what nationalism is. It's borders based on what? Based on one's race, based on one's colour, based on how someone looks. When the bond and the brotherhood of Islam trumps all of this. So that's the first thing, the failure of postmodern nationalism. Number two, the failure of allying with socialists and communists. This was a big mistake. This was a big mistake because whilst the sincere aspirations of our Uyghur brothers and the independence movement at the time, out of hardship and necessity, they were seeking allies. And Soviet Russia gave them that support, but it was very short-lived. It was very short-lived. And we saw that because Russia didn't come to their defense when China defeated them in 1933 in the Battle of Kashgar. And then Russia totally abandoned them in 1949 because China had adopted communism. That's the second lesson. And our brothers here from Uzbekistan, maybe they can shed some light with regards to the communist experience of 50, 60 years and the hardships that our brothers and sisters had to face there. Very similar to East Turkestan. Number three, the third lesson is that Uyghur Muslims, like many other Muslims, oppressed groups, are now turning to Islam. Not Islamism, not Islamist extremism, not jihadi ideology, no. They are turning to Islam because they realized that we've tried socialism, we've tried communism, we've tried every other ism in our aspiration to become independent and free. It hasn't worked because there seems to be a contradiction with regards to our identity and what we want and what these ideologies demand from us with regards to dictating and influencing our movement. And the same can be said in Kashmir. The early resistance movements weren't necessarily overtly Islamic. It became more Islamically orientated later on. And the same could be said for a number of resistance movements or independence movements or liberation movements in the Muslim majority world. That they've tried many things, they've tried all the ideologies on the market. But at the end, they always seem to turn to Islam because they feel that it has the answers to what true freedom means. And not freedom in the Western sense. Freedom as in to practice your faith according to Islam without fear, in a state of security. So this is a good thing. This is a good thing. And we need to be clever, and we need to be smart, and we need to ask questions. That whenever the Western media or Western governments or politicians say, oh, the Rohingya have adopted Islamist extremism, or certain Uzbek movements have adopted Islamist extremism. No, we ask questions. What do you mean by this? What are these groups calling for? Have they tried other things? Why is it that they've turned to what you believe to be Islamist extremism? There must be a reason. So we shouldn't adopt dominant narratives just because the Western media tells us this and that. And lastly, something which we can empathize with our brothers and sisters in East Turkestan is that they are experiencing structural Islamophobia, in that they are being persecuted and discriminated against simply because of being Muslim. Now, whilst our experience as Muslims in the UK is incomparable to what they are experiencing, are we not also witnessing with our own eyes Ofsted, a government educational regulatory body, wants to now think it's okay to ban the hijab in state schools, thinks it's okay to question young Muslim girls without their parents present about why they wear their hijab, why they are going to Islamic faith schools that were graded exceptional or outstanding, and then within a year they were put under special measures. Is it a coincidence that the Charity Commission, who I think even this masjid is regulated by, that it has been proven that they have been applying disproportionate resources to Muslim charities? And not just any Muslim charities that seem to be raising money for Syria, Palestine, Kashmir and others. Why, when demographically the Muslim charities number far less than everyone else, is so much resources going towards shutting down these charities? Is it any coincidence that more or less every single day you read some article or some news report, something about Muslims being bad or doing something crazy, whether it's halal meat, whether it's the niqab, whether it's how women dress, whether it's how men decide to marry, whether it's what we teach our children, whatever it may be, there's always something. There was also a report carried out by the UK Government Social Mobility Commission, which found that Muslims are 33% less chances of getting a job in the United Kingdom if your name happens to be Muhammad or Aisha. So if you apply for a job, you got Muhammad's CV here and John Smith's CV here, the prospective employer won't even look at your CV. This is what research has shown from a government body, the Social Mobility Commission, a research carried out last year. We are 33% disadvantaged. The Sun newspaper, not exactly my favorite at all, and I don't like citing them, they carried out a research just last month that if your name happens to be Muhammad and you ring up an insurance company for your car, you will get quoted at least £380 more than if your name was John or Adam. Same age, same time you've been passed, same car, same address. The examples are many. So this is something we can empathize and understand, that though our situation isn't that bad, and whilst there's no, alhamdulillah, that there's no re-education camps that they're going to stick us in here, we can understand that how state or government can slowly over time embed Islamophobia into its very institutions, where it becomes law, it becomes normal. Brothers, respected elders and sisters who are present, let's leave today's lecture with some action points. What can we do? Brother Dilly has given us a lecture, given us the reality of the Uyghur brothers and sisters in East Turkestan. But what can I do? Well, for the youth amongst us here, you must have access to Facebook, to Twitter. Utilize these platforms to raise awareness. Write blogs. If you want to write for my website, fivepillarsuk.com, come forward, I leave my details. Write, make vlogs, discuss. And not just discuss with other Muslims, discuss with Chinese people. I gave this same lecture at the University College London in November. And as I was entering the lecture hall, there was an economics class which had many Chinese students. I asked them to stay, they didn't stay. But it would have been good, because I think that many of them don't even know what's going on. And would they even support such policies being carried out by their government? So raise awareness. For the youth who have social media, utilize these platforms, vlogs, blogs, hashtag campaigns, and all of that. Reach out to Uyghur Muslims. Do we even know if there are any Uyghur Muslims in Purley or in South London or London? Find out. Find out if we have them here in this country. Reach out to them. Let them feel that you feel the hardship of our brothers and sisters in East Turkestan. Let them know that we don't differentiate between you and the Syrian, or you and the Kashmiri, or you and the Palestinian. You are the same. And I just want you to know that this is the feelings we have for you. Find out. Simple Google search. Uyghur society in Britain, Uyghur community in Britain, Uyghur restaurant. Just go to a restaurant, find out. Reach out to them. Let them know that they have a community of believers in this country that understand and are aware of what's happening in East Turkestan. And of course, we have to expose the Chinese government. In the very famous hadith Prophet ﷺ, when he was asked by one of the Sahaba radiallahu anh, Ya Rasulullah, what is the best form of jihad? Prophet ﷺ replied, Kalimatul Haqq, the word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. Not raising arms, not blowing anything up, just the word of truth to a tyrannical ruler. So we must expose and account the Chinese government. Write to them. Write letters to their embassies. Go to their embassies. Say, we are aware of what you are doing. Stop. And as part of this, we have to also account our Muslim governments. East Turkestan borders 5 Muslim countries. It borders Tajikistan, it borders, I believe, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and guess where else it borders? Pakistan. Do we have anyone here from Pakistan here? Can I see a raise of hands? You know where Gilgit is? Gilgit borders East Turkestan. And for those of you who are following Pakistani politics, you know that China and Pakistan's relationship is getting much better. Yes? Especially after Trump saying we're going to take aid away from you. The relationship, building developments, road developments, economic policies, things are getting better between China and Pakistan. But wasn't Pakistan founded upon Islamic values? Was it not founded or to be a land for the Pak? Was it not a country that was supposed to be a safe haven for the believers? So how is it that within Pakistan, they rightfully have certain laws and norms in protecting the izzah of Islam? Just over the northern border, your brothers and sisters cannot even possess the Mus'haf. How does that work? So, our respected elders and brothers who are of Pakistani origin, if you have family members who are within the political field, who are within the army, just remind them that this is the situation. We can do things. We raise awareness, we account the Chinese government, we remind our brothers and sisters who are within the proximity of East Turkestan that they do have a duty to raise this as an issue domestically. In the same way that we do the same when something happens in Gaza or Palestine, that we remind the neighboring Arab countries, irrelevant of how useless they may appear, the duty is still there. So at least on the Yawm al-Qiyamah we can say that, Ya Allah, I did what I could. I did the best to exhaust my efforts to relieve the plight of my brothers and sisters. Whether that materializes is in the hands exclusively of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And lastly, once you've exhausted everything, once you've exhausted all the means you could possibly do, you supplicate to Allah and you make dua to Allah every single day that He relieves the hardship and the plight of our brothers and sisters in all around the world. And then inshallah in our lifetime we see a time where the ummah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam is granted izzah and honor on this earth and in the akhirah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Really a comment as well as the question. Comment first. I went to China 4 years ago. It was Islamic tour of China. And we toured all the way in China, big cities, Shanghai, Beijing, Terracotta, everywhere. We went to Islamic restaurants, halal food. Ladies were serving in the car. The restaurants have pictures of Kaaba, Medina. We were impressed. We couldn't believe it. Probably the tour organizer knew all about it. That's why he took us. And I was surprised to hear from you. So I'm sure you're right. So what I'm wondering, why you did not use the media to publicize this thing? What's happening?
Jazakallah khairan, Uncle, for posing that comment. So Uncle asked, he went to China 4 years ago, and he visited a number of places in Islamic tour. He went to a number of sites and places and restaurants which were halal and stuff like this. Did you go to East Turkestan?
No, the media never heard of it.
Why would they take it? Yeah. You will, if you go home, you have the internet, you can put Uyghur Muslim, East Turkestan or Xinjiang, and you'll find a number of articles on the BBC and Sky, because they've recently started to report on it. With regards to why you went on this tour and were never told about this, when people go to Dubai, and this is a Muslim country, they won't take you to the sites, the building sites, where people who are also Muslim or maybe also non-Muslim from India, are forced to work out of mushkila in very difficult circumstances because it's not good PR, it's not a good image. In the same way that if there was an Islamic tour of Bangladesh, where my parents are from, they will take you to the nice places. They won't take you to the colonies and the ghettos, which is the vast majority, sadly. So I can understand why you went to this tour. I believe, if I'm correct, Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas radiallahu anhu, where is he buried? I believe he may be buried in China. He may, and this was the Prophet ﷺ's relative and one of the great Sahabas. So when it's a tourist kind of tour, they will take you to the nice places and they'll show how accommodating they are. But the reality is, go to the west of the country, the northwest of the country, and it's an entirely different situation there. In the same way that if you went to India, they'll show you all the nice places, but they won't show you what's happening in Srinagar, will they? They'll take you to the places.
So why do you not use the media? Because you've been suppressed or...
Okay, so the Chinese media won't really cover it. The Western media will selectively cover it based on their existing relationship with China. If things are okay with China, they won't necessarily report it. If there's some kind of issues happening, then they'll start showing, oh, this is what's happening to the Uyghurs. Because the media itself is a very politicized instrument. In the same way, in Bangladesh, and I'm trying to give examples of Muslim countries here, because if Muslim majority countries can do this, then we shouldn't be surprised that others don't do it. Uyghur Muslims of East Turkestan is not a fashionable topic. It's not a topic where China is bombing them. This is why I said this is structural Islamophobia. This is by law. By laws, the people are being persecuted. And you won't hear about it because journalists can't even enter these areas. Have you heard of many Western journalists enter North Korea? No, because they just can't enter these areas. But you hear about the accounts of the family members who have come to the West, like Brother Abdul Ghani Thabit. There's a sister in America called Gulchera. She's a very well-known Uyghur journalist. They report on these things. And at the end of the day, news only becomes what you can sell, uncle. Right? If news can sell, then reporters will cover it. If it doesn't sell, no one will cover it. Syria has been bombed for 6 years now. Only now and again you'll hear about Eastern Ghouta now, or Halep when it happened last December, right? When injustices are happening nearly every day in occupied Kashmir. You'll only hear about it now and again when something's happened, and it's usually from social media. When activists leak videos or run campaigns, that's when it happens. Or else the oppression and the issues happen. So it's unsurprising that you had an Islamic tour of China, but they didn't take you to the one place where most of the Muslims are. 20 million of them are there. And it's just PR. If they took you there, rest assured you would never pay for another Islamic tour. So I guess that's why.
There's some Muslims like in the southwest of China as well. So like I know that it's like one village on its own. Like, is it just an oppression in the north, or is it, would you say, like, in the rural areas as well that we may not hear about?
Okay. So East Turkestan is a vast area, and within that you get different cities and towns, Kashgar being the most famous. And then of course you get rural villages and townships within that. And it's not just Uyghurs either, it's Kazakh Muslims in China who are equally oppressed with similar laws. But it's more predominant and more overt in the area of Xinjiang. With regards to the area that you're talking about, sadly I cannot comment on it because I don't know much about that particular. Does it fall within the Xinjiang region?
No, it's really south.
Okay. The thing is, those laws may not affect them because remember, it's some of these laws are, how do you even pronounce that? Municipal, right? So it's like local authority laws, yeah? All dictated by central government, but it's implemented locally in light of the demographic makeup of a respective region. So they may be affected, they may not, all down to their respective municipality. But for sure, Xinjiang is where it will happen because that's the largest concentration of the Muslim population in China.
Hi, Janakala, for your talk. Just want to say, so it's touched on another comment that we made earlier, not to point out anything specific, but it's about borders and stuff. I mean, what we can learn from what's happening in that part of China, or Uyghur, is something that's recurring every time. I mean, if we look just recently, we had Romania, you had Central African Republic. And the excuse is that each border, each facing border or Muslim country that gives is the same thing throughout history. When you look at Armenia, the Bengalis would say, what can we do? When you look at Palestine, the Egyptian would say, what can we do? But what we don't learn from all this is what we should learn from Sirah. Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba were normal people. And yet it's the belief that changed them. It's the belief of what they were, what connects them to other Muslims, that made them, made them defeat the Quraysh when there were 300 in the Battle of Badr and there were 1,000. To understand who gives us victory, who gives us rizq. When we say rizq min Allah, what does that mean? When we say nasr min Allah, what does that mean? Yeah, to connect this idea of us being Muslim, before you were saying about contacting embassies and raising up the issue, but I think before we do this, we need to ask ourselves, what do we understand in this term of being Muslim and the Muslim identity? Well, it's no good we're doing this. Then I'm not Pakistani. My parents are from Mauritius, but my grandparents are from India, and yet you have what you call this Wataniya or Asabiya existing among us from a long time ago. So they would say that, oh, you're this part of India, you're better than somebody else from this part of India. You have Pakistanis doing the same thing. You have Bengalis doing the same thing. You have each country with little groups like this doing the same thing. Where is this place in Islam? What did Muhammad say about this? Unless we can clear this up amongst ourselves and question this issue, what connects us between all these countries, then that would make a difference. Correct me if I'm wrong, Imam, but when a trial comes on the people, it's not the people who are victims of the trial of what's happening in these countries that are suffering, or who should suffer, or will suffer. It's the people who are left behind. We are left behind. And mentally, it should affect us that we see our brothers in Syria, in Palestine, in all these countries being oppressed. And the trial is on us to know how we respond to all this, how we change all this.
The brother made a very beautiful point, and it's actually a talk in of itself, and it's a beautiful point. On the issue of asabiya or wataniya, it's outright racism. Ultimately, that's what it is, because it's something that's based on qawmiya, right? Whatever you want to call it. And this is something that is unequivocally rejected in our scripture. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that Muslimin al-ikhwa, the believers are our brothers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that hold on tight to the rope of Allah and do not be divided amongst yourselves, when He united your hearts when you were facing the pits of hellfire. Ample of hadith and ayats which indicate that Islamic unity and brotherhood trumps everything. However, I want to bring in what you just said there, Akhi, is spot on. I cannot fault it, I agree with you. I want to tie a point in with the point that our respected uncle raised. When we understand the modern world as we see it today, and see how it formulated, how it came into existence, what was there before it, you begin to understand that, remember, as a journalist, I reject conspiracy theories. It's not wise. Muslims should not peddle it. We should always aspire towards the truth and evidence-based discussions. So if we look at history, European colonialism ultimately shaped the world that we live in today. This is why when you look at Africa and the Middle East, you see straight lines. Literally straight lines. Prior to this, borders and frontiers were more fluid. They were more fluid. there were empires and dynasties and Islamic states, and the Europeans had their states, and borders were more fluid. What united people was usually faith, even in Christian Europe. What united the people, generally speaking, even though it's far more divisive for them, that's why they had the Christian Reformation, it was generally religion which tied the people together. This was never an issue for the Muslim Ummah. It was a problem for the Christian world because of the many problems that they had with the Roman Catholic Church, the fact that all their books and their religion was taught to them in Latin and not in their respective languages, the fact that the first Bible was translated into English by King James in the 17th century, whereas our deen was far more fluid. Hence why we saw vast revival and advancements in many fields. But to bring it back to the point the uncle raised earlier, that do we fully understand or appreciate the realities of what could happen if X country took X step? And he's correct. He's correct because this is the situation the unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in. Because the very notion of a nation state is one where the nation comes first before everything else. And we have many, maybe not many, we have some, and certainly Pakistan is definitely one of them, that were founded upon noble, very noble and laudable foundations and principles and values. And this is why I cited it in my talk, because the very foundation upon which it was found was one which was godly. How it became later and what it is today is another discussion. So, just to conclude on the point that you made, and draw the point that the uncle made, Islamic unity is not a dream. I can sit here and give you so many historical examples of Islamic rulers who intervened when they didn't have to intervene. When Khalif Harun al-Rashid, Mu'tasim, when he heard about the plight of a single Muslim woman in a land outside of Darul Islam, he said, I'm going to send my army there. He didn't have to do that. That was the dishonor of one woman. When Salahuddin al-Ayyubi rahimahullah, when he united the Muslims and liberated Jerusalem, prior to liberating Jerusalem, he had already controlled, the Ayyubi dynasty had already controlled vast swathes of Sham and Egypt. He didn't have to do that. He went out of his way to do that. Sayyid Qutuz rahimahullah, when he fought the Mongols in the Battle of Ain Jalut, he didn't have to go out of his way to fight the Mongols. They already had their Mamluk state in strength. He went out of his way. So leadership requires a certain level of courage, political foresight, and ultimately belief in Allah. That Nasrullah, indeed victory does come from Allah. But we also know from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ that he took precautions. He assessed his reality, he assessed the pros and cons. We saw this in Badr, we saw this in Uhud, we saw this in Khandaq, that he did all that he could to understand the reality, what would be harmful, what would be strategic, etc., etc. So it's a balancing of those things. But just to conclude, Asabiya, the modern nation state, I believe is a huge obstacle towards unity, because this notion, I graduated in politics, and one of the modules we studied was the birth of the nation state. This is a new thing. The very countries which we see today on the maps are very new. Many of them are 100 years maximum, but the vast majority are 60, 70 years. Before that, empires and states were far more fluid. And the issue of Muslims intervening for the sake of their brothers is not something that's unheard of. We shouldn't listen to the stories of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi for bedtime stories. These are stories for us to take lessons from, right? And for sure, there are Salahuddin, and there are Sayyid Qutuz, and there are Al-Mu'tasims within this ummah. And it is a case of awakening, right? And like I said, we pray to live to see that time, inshallah. Inshallah. The brother there, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
In terms of, you're talking about what we can do in the world today now. Yes. See, one of the things that you highlighted and some of the people have mentioned is economic, right? And we talked about the deals that Pakistan is doing with China, or even other, China is now having so much influence on other Muslim countries. Now, even if, as a Muslim Ummah, we were able to just deal with each other on an economic basis and have that economic power against China, they would change.
You are correct, and I don't want to sound like a song on repeat, but there's a fundamental thing here. When national interests dictate priorities, this is the unfortunate reality, and we shouldn't just single out Pakistan. And we shouldn't single out, but there's a reason why, and I want to clarify this. The reason why I said this is because we have love and izzah and hope. Some countries you have more hope than others. When you look at Turkey, when you look at Pakistan, when you look at certain countries, you think, okay, there's goodness in these countries, there's huge potential. That's why the Ummah sometimes mentions more countries than others. With regards to economic unity and like a concerted effort to boycott, we saw that this actually happened in the 70s with the oil embargo boycott by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, brought the Western economy to its knees for a couple of days, like literally brought it to its knees. He was later assassinated, right? So for sure, there is huge potential in what political and economic unity can bring. But ultimately, and sadly, it does boil down to the national interests of the country come first. The way it's disseminated to the masses is that the priority is to feed you and to provide you security, even though that in of itself is questionable, how that plays out in real life. But you are correct. Again, it's not a point I can disagree with. It's more of a point of how do we move towards that. And in terms of everyday Muslims like us, it can only come from engagement. To continue to talk about these things and to discuss it and to exchange ideas. Maybe we hold certain positions that we're incorrect on. Maybe someone else will provide another perspective which will make us think, okay, maybe we weren't right about that. But engagement is surely the first stage towards influencing higher level decisions. Because we've also seen from the Arab Spring, even though sadly it's a very unfortunate situation how the Arab Spring played out now. But when it initially began, we saw that it was a very grassroots focused movement. It was a movement that wasn't necessarily led by one Islamic group or one political group or one particular student union group. It was a collective movement. And then what ended up happening in countries like Libya and Syria is entirely a different discussion. But initially when it began in 2011, the intentions were pure, and it was one to essentially seek justice. And that's why Arab Spring spread like fire. Started in Tunisia, and within months it had shaken the entire Arab world. So engagement is the first thing. We have uncles, brothers, friends, people in position of influence and authority. You have to engage, and engage in a manner in which is uncompromising but compassionate and loving as well. Because sometimes we can steer people away from us out of harshness. And harshness sometimes can be the outcome of zeal and passion. So engagement, accountability, and seeing that how this will influence the higher level decisions is our consistency and our continuity in having these discussions at every level. From your colleagues, from your family and friends, even with non-Muslims. Because sometimes I've been in discussion with non-Muslims and they've turned out, why are you guys so disunited? Whenever something happens in a European country, we're there. EU's there, NATO's there. You guys have the Arab League, you have the OIC, a bunch of useless guys. I've had this with fellow colleagues, educated white non-Muslims. And they ask, they go, you have these unions and things, but you seem very, quite useless. And then engage them in the discussion.
The two brothers there, you made a very good point. Man al-Nasir Allah, man ala kulli shay'in qadir is Allah. I think we're missing a massive point. Before we get to the media, this is just my point of view, it doesn't mean I'm right. Would you think it would be much better if most of us, or even just a minority of us, you get up at 3 a.m, when we put our head down, say Subhana Rabbil A'la 3 times, cry to Him, because 20 beat 200. Allah has got His own soldiers, we all know that.
Absolutely.
Before we go to the media, isn't it so powerful if we get up at that time without anyone knowing that, oh, Miss so-and-so is doing Qiyam al-Layl and is crying to Allah? I think that is most important to me than going to the media, because personally I don't use Facebook. I don't use Twitter because I've asked some scholars, they won't avoid it if you can. I've asked a few scholars when I've been told to go to London and say what's happening in Rohingya and all the rest of it. They said because Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he hasn't done such thing. The scholar I spoke to, he said, Akh Saeed, if you really want to do something, get up when everyone is asleep, because Allah does not say something without delivering. If he says, Ad'uni astajib lakum, there is certain time in a day that where basically the sky, the door of the sky opens up to his believers. Now it's up to us how much we believe in that, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he does yuhyi wa yumit. Believe it or not, it is what it is. So in order to go to the media, I think the most important thing is to cry to him when everyone else is asleep.
Jazakallah khair, my dear brother. I'm just going to conclude on this point. And when I spoke about action points, did I not conclude with supplication?
Yes.
I did. When Prophet ﷺ made all the preparations for his engagements, be it Badr, Uhud, Khandaq, and many other engagements, he cried to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at night in tears, to the extent in the night of Badr, Prophet Abu Bakr came and so he was in tears. He went, Ya Rasulullah, stop, this is enough. If you read, this is in the seerah, he saw Prophet ﷺ in tears out of making dua. But prior to this, he had done everything. The thing here is, within the ummah, you have different people with different strengths, and you have different people who can give izzah and assist in different areas. Not everyone can go to the media, not everyone can write and vlog, not everyone has social media, and there will be differences in approaches on ijtihadi matters, right? But there's a point I always make to university students when I go and give talks at ISOCs, and it's this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that indeed we have raised you as the best nation among mankind because you engage in what is good and forbid what is evil and believe in Allah. He also subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Fussilat that who is better in speech than the one who invites to Allah, does righteous and says indeed I am of the Muslims. Prophet ﷺ also says that the believers are those who when they see a munkar, he changes with his hands. If he cannot do that, he will speak out against it, and the worst is hating it from within. So we know that this is the framework of the believer. And it always goes down to the point that we do not separate the worldly with the spiritual, because we then become secularists in our approach. We know that to go and work and provide for our families is a form of worship, is it not? To go and provide and support for our wives and our children and our mothers is a form of worship, it's a form of ibadah. We do not separate between the two. So therefore we do not separate between activism and da'wah. We do not separate between the spiritual and the worldly because they are the same thing. And the problem appears when you start making these things separate. When you do the worldly without the spiritual, when you do the spiritual without any acknowledgement of the worldly. We are aware from the stories that there was a city where there was one abid, one man who worshipped Allah. And Allah sent the angels to destroy this city. The angels came back when, Ya Rabb, there's one person there who's praying to you. What did Allah say? Destroy this man first. So the point I'm trying to make here, my dear brother, is the balance. It's the balance. We do not exert and focus exclusively or solely or disproportionately to one over the other. We should be in Qiyamul Layl. We should be praying Tahajjud. We should be doing all of these things for spiritual enrichment and for the fortitude that we require to deal with our outwardly stuff. But that does not mean that we become monks who do not do nothing. Because this is not from our deen. We do both. We are instructed to do both. We enjoin in good, we forbid evil. We are truthful in speech. We invite to Allah. And we believe in Allah. And we say we are of the Muslims. And we know that victory solely comes from Him. Now with regards to, I just want to conclude on this point, there are differences with regards to the permissibility of social media, the permissibility or how rulers should be accounted. I know there are theological and fiqhi differences. Even the ulama of the past had it. We know that Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, rahimahullah, he was renowned for what? He was renowned for accounting the Abbasid Khalif of the time because of his Mu'tazilite affiliation and beliefs. We know that Imam Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, said to account the scholar at the gates of the rulers. These were khulafa who established Islam, but even seeing them waver, they had very stern positions. But we also know the issue of rebellion and what rebellion can cause certain countries and certain lands. So it's about ultimately striking a balance. We do not separate the two because we become secularists. This is what the Yahud and the Nasara did. This is what they did. They took their rabbis as lords. They started making the halal the haram. And we are the community of believers.
Yeah, but the point I'm trying to make,
and your point is valid.
we cry to Allah more than
Which we should.
focusing about the media, because Allah is a Khaliq al-Bari al-Musawwir.
Absolutely.
It is Him that we need to cry to. It
Absolutely.
is Him that we need to say what is the problem. It is Him. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. He created us, we don't go back to Him.
Absolutely.
So if we ask Him, I reckon, to me, that's my opinion, that's what I just
Your
said
opinion is
earlier
right.
on.
Your opinion is
My
right.
opinion is 3 o'clock in the morning, guys, if you want anything in life, in the dunya or akhirah, talk to the Khaliq.
So,
The media, because in my eyes, the media is all controlled by the Zionists. They all know what's going on in Syria. They all know they are destroying Muslims right, left and centre. But nobody, even though that the Muslims, Muslim countries, their leaders, they are Algerian. The Algerians, they all know what's going on.
Algeria had its experience in the 90s.
Exactly. But, you know, what happened then? You know, the public got killed. In the end of the day, it's for me, to make a difference, it's, yeah, Allah stage of that, that's all I can say.
I'd be concerned and worried if anyone who engaged in some of the action points I didn't turn to Allah. I'd be very worried. I'd be very worried that if anyone was engaged in da'wah and activism in the public but did not turn and cry to Allah for victory and nasr and help and assistance. So as I said, both go hand in hand and we shouldn't separate the two, and the two are in of the same things. And we'll take a last question from the brother there. Did you have a question?
A comment. It was just that I think we're all in agreement anyway. That if there's any disagreement,
There was no
I disagree with you either. It's saying we need all things at the same time, because we always say we believe in Quran and Sunnah. Yeah, we shouldn't take part of the book and reject another part of the book.
Of course.
And this is making dua. You know, using our arms, speaking out, is all from Islam.
Tell them come
Yeah.
for Fajr, inshallah ta'ala.
Yeah, it's all from Islam.
Leave 3 o'clock, Fajr.
Yeah.
Come for Fajr first.
Okay, brothers, leave 3 o'clock. This is come for Fajr.
So how about come for Fajr? Pray 5 days Salah.
That's an opinion.
Now, my dear brother, your opinion was legit.
So everybody's opinion.
Every single person here should be aspiring to wake up in the middle of the night. This is something people should aspire to. Of course, without a shadow of a doubt. And I said this, that we should be very worried that if we're engaged in these kind of good deeds, but fundamentally our secret deeds don't match what we're doing publicly. It's a contradiction. So there's nothing which my respected uncle said there, or my dear brother said there, or my brother that says is incorrect. But do you know what this shows? It reflects the many different strengths and perspectives that's required, and the collective effort that's required to change our situation.